Today, instead of an animation, we're going to be creating this particular render, a magical flower. So we're going to learn the modeling as well as the texturing. In our default scene, we're going to keep the default cube. We're just going to scale it down on the z-axis quite a bit and then go into the modifiers properties over here and add in our subdivision surface modifier. For now, we can keep the levels at 2. However, we will be increasing this all the way to 4 sometime really soon. Now to actually make changes and make this into our petal shape, we're going to press tab to go into edit mode. We're just going to add in a loop cut right in the center, just like this and like this. And once we're done with that, we can just press 2 to go to edge select mode, or we can select this button up here and we can select these two edges and we can select these two edges. Remember, Shift plus Alt allows you to select an entire edge loop, and then we can select these two and then just grab them on the z-axis to move them up. Right after we're done with that, we can select these as well as these, which are the bottom ones, and grab them on the z-axis to move them up. Finally, we can select this one over here, grab this on the z-axis to move it up even more, and we can also grab it on the y-axis and just move it back like that, and that gives our general petal shape. If you want, you can take this and just grab this a little bit back on the y-axis, and this is our petal shape. Now this looks way too fat, and since it's a bit too fat, we should have made it thin right at the start, but since we didn't, I'm going to tab back out into object mode and then scale it on the z-axis just like that, and now we have our thin petal. You can go ahead and play around with these settings just to get the petal shape that you desire. So I'm just going to select the middle edge loop and make it a bit wider, and along with that, go ahead and increase subdivisions all the way to 4. That looks like a very smooth petal. So now we're going to go ahead and switch to object mode and then select the object drop down menu and change to shade smooth. Now we can just rotate on the x-axis a bit until the base touches the floor. So if you actually press 1 to go into front view or 3 to go into the side view, you should be able to see where the base is. So let's just grab it on the z-axis by pressing GZ and tilting it up and then rotating about the x until we have this tip touching the floor. So right now you can still see that the tip is not touching the floor. So grab it on the Z, move it up, rotate X and bring it down. And once we have it touching about there, it should be fine. So this is going to be our leaf. Now we can press tab to go back into edit mode. We can select this particular edge and then we can press Shift S, cursor to selected. Once you've done that, you can go back into object mode and then object set origin to 3D cursor. So that way the object's origin is set over here, and when we actually rotate it, it'll always rotate about that particular point now. Once you're done with that, we can press Ctrl A to apply the scale, and then you can press Alt G to clear its location. Then you can press Ctrl A, all transforms. We can also do Shift S, cursor to world origin, in case we need to add in objects later on. So we're gonna now add in an empty around which we're going to place all of our petals. So we can press Shift A, empty, plane axes, and then we can select our petal. Under the modifiers, add in a new modifier, which is going to be the array modifier. And instead of the relative offset, we're going to decheck that and select object offset. Then we're just going to expand the panel, and for the object, we're going to select our empty, and then we're going to select our empty and rotate it on the z-axis by something like 20 degrees, and we can see how our next petal has appeared. Now we can select our petals and just increase the count till we get the number required, and clearly we can see that 20 degrees causes way too many petals. Of course, if this is the type of flower you're going for, go ahead, but we're going to go for a flower that has only 6 petals. So I'm going to say 360 divided by 6, which is 60 degrees, or maybe I'll use 12 petals, so I'll go with 30 degrees. Sorry, a count of 12. And for our empty, we're just going to press Alt R to clear its rotation and then rotate on the z-axis by 30 degrees so that 12 petals make 360 degrees. So now you can see these petals are slightly intersecting with each other, and we don't want that. So we can actually just rotate them on the x-axis a little bit, and that'll prevent the intersection as well as tilt the flower a bit, which is exactly what we want. And I think instead of 12, I'm going to reduce the count to 6, and I'm going to increase the rotation on this to 60 degrees. Just rotate on the x as well, and just hide the array modifier so that we can play around with the shape a little bit more. So I'm just selecting these two edges and grabbing it up to give it some more of a curve in that way, and select this edge, grab it on the Z, just bring it up a bit, and maybe I can grab it on the Y to bring it inward. And every time you do this, you'll end up with a slightly different shape. I guess that's the one thing about this, because you end up doing it slightly different every single time. And remember, always save your files, so press Ctrl S and just save an incremental version every single time. So I'm just going to press Ctrl R to add in one more loop cut right there. And then I'm going to take this and grab it down on the z-axis, just like that. I'm going to select this edge as well as this edge, and then just scale it down. Along with that, scale these down a little bit. And yeah, this is the shape that I'm going for as of now, but it might change a little later. Let's grab this on the Y and spend time on this how much ever you feel like to get the exact shape that you are looking for. Remember, I'm keeping the geometry fairly low, and it's just the subdivision surface modifier that is allowing me to make this look fairly decent. Once we have our shape to exactly what we want, you can go ahead and unhide the array modifier, and this is what we have. So now that we have the petals ready, generally in a flower, we also have the ovary right in the center. So we're going to model that right now. And to model that, we're just going to go ahead and hide the cube. And to name everything and make it more clear, we're going to rename the cube to flower. And then we're just going to hide this. Now we're going to press Shift A and search for mesh UV sphere. We're going to press 1 to go into the front view. We're also going to switch on transparency using this button. We're going to press tab to go into edit mode, or you can use the drop down menu over here. Then have face select on, double tap A to deselect everything, B for box select, and just leave the first 4 and bottom 4 rows and select everything else, and then press I twice to allow insetting along individual faces and just scale it in to something like that. And then we can press Alt E to allow extruding faces along normals. Once you've selected that, just pull it in a little bit. Something like this is fine. And then tap back out to go into object mode and also switch off X-ray. So once we have this, you can go ahead and add in a subdivision surface modifier and increase the levels to something like 3 or 4. And of course, object shade smooth. So this is going to act like our ovary. So we're going to unhide the flower. And now you can just press R twice to allow trackball and rotate it so that all the holes are there in front. So once you've rotated it, press Ctrl A to apply the rotation. And once you apply the rotation, you can scale it on the Z axis and just flatten it down. Then GZ to grab it on the Z and just bring it up so that we have it here. In fact, for our use case, we can scale it down to something like that, and that should be all right. We can just grab it on the Z axis and bring it to just about there. And that is our ovary. So now from our ovary generally comes out a few stamen as well as the actual pollen tube. And generally a leaf has about, or a flower has about 5 to 6 stamen. So we're just going to go ahead and use some curves. So we can press Shift A and search for a curve Bezier. And once we have the Bezier curve, rotate it on the y-axis by 90 degrees, and you're going to actually see it. And you can grab it on the z-axis to just move it up till the base is somewhere around the top. But this is a bit too large for my stamen. So I'm just going to scale it down to something like that, and then GZ, bring it down. And that's about the right size for a stamen. Remember, the pollen tube is going to be much longer than the rest of the stamen. So once we have that set, we can press 7 to go into the top view, and then just Shift D, move this about, rotate on the Z axis, and then also press Tab to go into edit mode. Maybe select one of the vertices like this, and then just rotate that one about to just make some variation, because we're going to be adding 6 of these, and all 6 of them should look slightly different, if not completely different. So again, take this, Shift D, bring it here, rotate it, and then press Tab to go into edit mode, and then rotate this to something like that. And then take this one again, Tab, take this, just rotate it a little bit straighter. This one as well. I don't want them to be rotated that much. So there we have 3. Now we can just Control Shift click all of these. So just Shift click each of them, and then press Shift D, enter, R, Z, and rotate these by some arbitrary amount. Tab to go into edit mode and just rotate their handles to make them different. Once you're happy with your 6 stamen, you can go ahead and place them a bit towards the sides of your ovary and make sure that you don't accidentally move the empty that's used to create the array of our petals. So remember, this is the empty that's being used to create the array, and we don't actually need it because we've already applied the array. So in fact, we can select our flower and just apply the modifiers. So let's apply the array modifier and apply the subdivision surface modifier. And then we can select our empty and press X delete. So now that we have each of our stamen in place, we can go ahead and deal with the settings under the object data properties or the curve properties. We could have done this right at the start so that we don't have to do it for all 6 of these individually, but I forgot. So in this case, add 1 and then change the resolution preview to something like 32 to make it a lot smoother. And then under geometry, change the bevel depth to something like 0.01. And once you've done that, you can actually go ahead and duplicate it to all of the others. But in my case, I'm just going to go ahead and do it manually. And once you've done that, you can go ahead and convert all of them into a mesh. Make sure you're happy with the shape and positioning of it. And if you are, go ahead and press Object, Convert to Mesh. So now each of them are their own meshes, but they're all individual meshes. So we can press Ctrl J and join them, and they all become one single mesh. Once you've done that, you can press Tab to go into edit mode. And remember, at the top of the filament for every stamen stays the anther. So we're going to go ahead and model the anther. And how we're going to do that is we're just going to select one row. So just have the edge select on, and then just go to like the third bottom ring or whatever you feel like, and just Alt click to get the entire ring, and switch on proportional editing by opening this button or by pressing the letter O. So O toggles this button, and then once it's on, press scale, and you see everything is starting to scale, and that's because this size of our proportional editing is too large. So we're going to just go ahead and move our scroll wheel till it's affecting just this particular filament. So you can just go ahead and increase its size to something like that. Then you can just switch off proportional editing and scale this as well a little bit more, and just play around till you're happy with the shape you get. And then finally, the top of these are open. So just Alt Shift click the entire ring and press F to fill it. And one thing that you can do is go to the modifiers and just add in another subdivision surface modifier. And that just makes it a lot smoother and it just looks a lot better. So now you can go ahead and do that for the others as well. So it's just Alt Shift click the entire ring and then just scale it up. But press O for proportional editing, scale it up. Then switch off proportional editing, scale this one up a little bit more. Then take this, Alt Shift click F. So once you're done with all of that, that will be your stamen. Now we have to create the stigma. So for that, we're just gonna add in yet another Bezier curve. Again, rotate on the y-axis by 90 degrees. And this time we can just scale it on the z-axis to get it fairly tall. Again, grab it on the z-axis and scale it down. And we also don't want this to be rotated that much. So we're just going to take this and rotate it like that. And there, now we have our style coming up for our actual pistil. So the stigma is what's right on top, and we have our pistil coming down over here. So we have to give this all of the materials as well, or the properties as well. So the render preview is going to be 32. We're going to go ahead and give it a bevel depth of 0.02. So it's slightly thicker than our stamen. And for the stigma, we're just going to convert this into a mesh. Press tab, and we're going to go to the modifiers, add in a subdivision surface modifier, increase the levels to 2, and then go to face select, select this top ring of faces, press Alt E, extrude faces along normals, and then just scale it up. And that gives us this weird shape. Of course, we're going to have to fill in this particular face. So go to edge select mode, Alt Shift click to get that entire ring, and press F to fill it. Then again in face select mode, we can just select these faces and then grab it on the local Z and just bring it down. And that gives the rough shape of the stigma of the pistil. So we can bring this and this up as well. And that's the shape that I want to go for. So once we have that shape created, because I feel like it's a bit too tall on the Z, I'm just going to scale it down on the Z, Z, bring it down. So yeah, once we have that, we can go ahead and create the sepals, which generally exist around any flower. Of course, that part is not necessarily compulsory for stylistic renders like this, but I'm going to go ahead and create them. We'll press Shift D to duplicate our flower system, and then just scale them down, scale them on the z-axis, and then grab them on the z-axis and bring them down like that. Once you have this done, rotate it on the z-axis so that they come like midway between the petals. And of course, I'm scaling it down on the z-axis even more, then grabbing it on the z-axis and just covering it up. So that way we can't see the bottom of our ovary that we created. So that actually helps cover up a mistake. And apart from that, press tab to go into edit mode. Make sure proportional editing is switched on. Select different faces and then proportionally just grab them and move them around. But right now you see this face is not leading into this upper region, but in case it does, because there is quite a bit of overlap, you can just select a face. So you can switch on transparency to see which face you've selected, and just switch it off, and then go ahead and grab it on the Z and just bring it down a bit. So you can do that to help change the shape around as well. And this makes it look a lot more organic and realistic, because realistically, nothing would have been absolutely perfect or the same. So if you just play around with a few of these, grab them here and there, bring this down. It doesn't even have to be for a reason. It'll just help create more realism. But when you're doing it, make sure that if in case there's some region where like, okay, this area, you can see the ovary, you can grab it and just move it up. So you're doing this to both add a little bit of randomness and imperfections, and also at the same time, you're fixing up any mistakes or possible future issues that you might face. So here, again, it's going up, so just grab it down and just play around with it till you're satisfied. So these are our sepals and they've been created. So we can actually go ahead and label this as sepals. This object, our Bezier curve 002, is actually our stamen, and this Bezier curve is actually our pistil. And with that, we finish our modeling. So we can go ahead and increase our timeline and change it from the timeline to the shader editor so that we can start off with the texturing. Remember, I'm not creating this as an animation, so we don't have to worry about the timeline at all. However, we do have to worry about how we place our camera. So before we start the shading, it's best to keep our camera exactly where we want it. So we can press 0 on our numpad to go into the camera view, tap N to open this side panel, change to view, and check camera to view. Now we can move this around freely to get it to exactly wherever we want it to be. So once we get a nice position, I think I want the flower to be rotated. And in order to do that, instead of rotating the flower, what I can do is I can just change the pivot from global to view and then rotate on the Z to rotate the camera itself. So that way you don't actually have to worry about parenting everything to an empty or anything like that. So you can just search for any angle that you think works. So for this render, I think I'm going to go with this particular angle, and I'm going to keep the flower in this corner as well. And then once you're happy with where the camera is positioned, press N and switch off camera to view so that you don't accidentally move your camera. So once you're done with that, you can go ahead and select your petals and label the material as petals. Remember, because we use the default cube, the default material is still linked to it. And to actually see the changes from the material actually come up to our viewport, we change the viewport shading to rendered. Along with that, we can go to our render properties, switch on bloom, ambient occlusion, screen space reflections, and then we can go ahead and go to the world properties and change the color to something fairly dark, almost black, and then switch off overlays. So once we're done with that, in our principled BSDF, we can go ahead and search for a noise texture and a color ramp. Then we can plug the color from the noise texture into the factor of the color ramp, and we can change the color ramp to have the colors that we want our flower to be. So we can select the black handle and change it from black to a nice pinkish color or a nice reddish color, and we can change the white handle to the pinkish color, something like this. And then we can go ahead and plug this into the color of the principled BSDF. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to search for a glass shader and plug the color into the color, and then the principled BSDF into the surface. So now you can see what it currently looks like. And since it's a glass shader, it's just reflecting most of it off, and it is an Eevee. To fix that, we need to increase the roughness to something like 0.5. So now we can actually see reflections happening from the surface of our glass shader, and it just seems a lot glossier and more like a metal. One thing that we have to do is under screen space reflections, check refraction as well. So now we can go ahead and play with the color ramp and the scale of our noise texture just to get the colors that we want. And finally, take the light, press Alt G to clear location, then GY to move it up, GX to move it to the side, then again GY to move it up again, and just play around with it till you get to some region that you're happy with. Now we want to actually duplicate the light, so Shift D and then just bring it down so that the bottom is also lit, but just very, very little. So now again, with our petals selected, we have our glass shader, but we need some sort of emission, and we're going to use that or create that emission with the principled BSDF. We could use an emission shader, but I also want to include some bump later on. So that's why we're going to use the principled BSDF. We're going to go ahead and just take this noise texture and color ramp itself and plug that into the color of the emission, and everything's going to light up. But we don't want that. We want only the edges to light up. So in order to do that, we're going to have to play around with the strength. However, instead of playing around with the strength, we do have to mix this with the glass BSDF And so we can go ahead and search for a mix shader, and we can plug the principled BSDF in over here, increase the emission strength to something like 5, and we can play with the factor instead of the strength down there to get only the edges to light up. So for the factor, we're going to search for layer weight node and a color ramp to control the layer weight. And finally, we're going to take the Fresnel of the layer weight and plug that into the factor and plug the color of the color ramp into the factor of the mix shader. Then you can play around with the blend as well as the color ramp to get just the edges to light up. So for the bump, we have to add in a normal value over here. However, I think I'm going to skip that out for this particular render. Instead, I'm going to use that. It just gets the cell shaded look by playing around with the roughnesses. So of course, if you want it to happen in the actual petals, you're going to have to play around with the roughness of the glass BSDF, because that is what's being applied in the petal regions, and the actual principled BSDF is being applied only for the edges. So in fact, I don't have to use the principled BSDF. I can use just an emission shader. So we're going to press Shift S to switch it, and we're going to search for a shader and make this an emission shader. So that way it's just much lighter on the computer to render. We're going to increase the strength to 10, and there we have it. Let's search for a Voronoi texture, and if you change this from F1 to distance to edge and you control shift click it with the node wrangler switched on, you can see that it gives this nice cell type look. If you actually increase the scale, that's exactly what a leaf or a petal would have in close-up. So let's make this 120, and we'll just take this and plug this into the roughness of our glass shader, and then control shift click the mix shader to see what the outcome actually looks like. So that's all right for now, but I don't want it to be this dark over here. So what I'll have to do is search for a color ramp, and the black has to be lifted up a little bit. That way it's not completely glossy. So bringing it up to something like that and bringing the white in all the way to there just gave it that nice look, and that's what I'm going for. Now we can deal with our sepals. So by default, since we duplicated a material that already had the material, it has the material set to it. We can press this button to duplicate it, and we can change this to the sepals. And all we're going to do is change the colors. So instead of red and pink, this one we're going to make blue and a slightly darker blue. So this is a very light blue, and this is going to be a darker blue. Of course, biologically, it should be green. So I'm actually going to keep it light blue and a green, and that color that it's giving is fair enough. However, I also want this to be even brighter, and I'm going to change the blend like 0.4, that a little bit more of it is emissive. So once you're happy with that, you can go ahead and select the flower, and inside that you can select the sphere, which was supposed to be our ovary. Of course, you can rename that as ovary, and that's also going to get the same material as our petals and sepals, except we're going to press this duplicate button, call this ovary, and make this a yellowish color. So take the red and make it yellowish, and take this pink and make that one orangish. So that's our center of the flower. Then for the actual stamen, we're going to create a new material. This is going to be called Stamen, and it's just going to be a simple emission shader. So we're going to press X and search for emission, and we're going to plug that into the surface. However, as usual, the strength is going to be controlled using a layer weight node. So search for a layer weight node, and the Fresnel is what we're going to pass into the strength, but we want more control over the strength. So we're going to search for a math node set to multiply. So take the math node and change it from add to multiply, increase the value to something like 10. And now you can just play around with the blend until you have just a little portion of it becoming darker. So something like this. Now just increase the value. And if you're not getting exactly what you want, as usual, search for a color ramp to get better control. So the color ramp goes in right about there, and bring the black in by just a tiny bit. Increase the blend, bring the black in, and maybe just increase it from black to a very, very slight gray, and then change the color to something like blue. So there we have our stamen, and along with the stamen, we now have to create something for our pistil. So that's going to get the same thing as our stamen, except we're going to create it as a new material, and we are going to go ahead and change this to a nice fiery red pink kind of material. So this kind of a color suits that. So with that, we actually finish the texturing for our actual flower. And now we have to start off with the background details. So essentially we want to create the pollen that goes around this region. So to do that, we're going to press Shift A and search for a UV sphere. And this is going to be our particle emitter. We're just going to grab that and bring that to about there and scale it up to about the size of the flower. So something that is fine. And now we can go to the particle properties and add in a new particle system. Now we're going to change the frame end to 1 as well, so that everything comes out in the first frame. And for the source, we're going to change emit from faces to emit from volume. So that way it's going to come inside the sphere. However, we cannot see it right now because the sphere is blocking it. So we have to go to our viewport display and switch off show emitter. And similarly for the render, we're also going to switch off show emitter. So this is where we have our spheres as of now, but we don't want to render them as these halos. We have to render them as an object. So we have to add in the object that they're going to render as. So let's press Shift A, and under mesh, we're going to search for the icosphere. And before we do anything, go to the drop down over here and change the subdivisions to 1, just so that it's easier for our laptop to render. So now let's select our sphere again, and under the render as, we're going to change it from halo to object, and we are going to select the icosphere for the instanced object. You can just select it from the outliner in case you're unable to select it from here. So from the icosphere right there, and now we have a ton of icospheres. Now we can select our actual icosphere and give it a new material, and that's again just going to be a simple emission shader. We're going to plug that into the surface. We're going to increase the strength to something like 20, and we want each particle to have one of 3 colors. So we're going to search for a color ramp, and we're going to change it from linear to constant, and we're going to press the plus to add in a new handle. So the first handle, we're going to change it to something like a pink, slightly desaturated pink. The second handle, we're going to bring it somewhere towards 1/3, and we are going to change that one to maybe a red color. And the third handle, we're going to bring that in and make this more of a purplish bluish color, so something like that. And now we can plug that into the color. Now all of them are just going to choose what's at 0.5 because we haven't decided which one gets what. So for that, we're going to search for an object info node, and we're going to take the random output from this and plug that right into the factor. So now they're getting random values. Now the problem is that they're a lot larger than we want. So we can go to the particle properties over here, just select our sphere again, and under the render, we're going to change the scale from 0.5 to 0.05, and they become 10 times smaller. And we're going to increase the scale randomness all the way to 1. That way we get some really tiny objects and some really larger objects, and we're going to take it and just grab it so that the main concentrated sphere at the center is right about our stamen and our pistil. So that's the ones that are inside the flower, and you see everything's outshined by this icosphere that we have right here. We don't need to see that, so we can just hide it from both our view as well as our render. So now one more thing that I want to just make change is switch on overlays, go down to our sepals over here and select the sepals, then press tab to go into edit mode. Just select one from each of the different sepals, or you can press Ctrl+7 to just view it straight on. Maybe go to object mode for this. Just select one from each of these, and then with proportional editing, just scale them down to close up that gap, and also scale them or grab them on the z-axis and make sure you change it from view to global, and then grab it on the z-axis and just bring it down, something like that. So now when you go back and you actually go to the rendered view, that's what it looks like, and I think that just looks a little bit better. So now again, with our sphere selected, all the particles are there inside. We can press Shift D to duplicate it, and then we can scale it even larger. And once you scaled it like that, just grab it on the view Z. So that means we have to change it from global to view, and then grab it on the Z so that we can just move it back. Why we're moving it back is so that when we apply our depth of field, these particles go out of focus and just become a nice bokeh-like effect. Along with that, we want the scale to be slightly larger. So in order to do that, we're just going to duplicate this to make that its own particle system, and then change this scale from 0.05 to 0.01, maybe 0.2 as well. And now we can go ahead and apply the depth of field to our camera. So switch on overlays, select our camera, go to the camera properties over here, viewport display passport out, we're going to increase to 1 so that we just see what's inside. And we can switch on depth of field, go to focus on object, we can select our pistil, because that's right at the center of our flower. And then the f-stop we can decrease all the way to something like 0.2. Switch off overlays, and that's what it currently looks like. Now just keep increasing the f-stop until everything that's in our main render comes into focus and everything outside has a nice bokeh effect. Something like that might look good. However, I'm just going to select our sphere at the back, scale it up so that we have much fewer particles actually coming into picture, and we're going to go ahead and increase the scale of those as well. So under the render, object scale 0.08. Now the last thing that we have to do is the actual background. So in our shader editor, from object, we're going to change it to world. And for the background, we're just going to search for a noise texture and a color ramp, and we're going to plug this color into the factor. We're going to change the strength down to 0.01 for now, and we're going to change this white to our pinkish reddish color, so something like that, and plug this into the color. If you can see anything in the background, that's what it looks like for now. Now we're just going to bring the black in, increase the scale, and just increase the strength, maybe definitely not 0.1 but 0.02. With that in the background, that looks good enough for my final render. So this is how you can create a nice magical flower with a pollen and everything. And hopefully you learned something, and you can apply this to not just create a flower, but anything that you think would suit. Again, this was a longer tutorial, so we're going to make sure that all of the different chapters are written in the comments or in the description, and you can just skip to whichever one you like. Regular videos are going to be coming out, so stay tuned and stay creative.